Well, the long-awaited album by 21 Pilots, Clancy, is finally here, and I also at last have a physical copy of the album in hand. So over the course of this video, I'm going to be doing a track-by-track analysis and review of the entire album, all 13 songs. But before we get into that, I have some thoughts on the album as a whole. Clancy is definitely one of their best albums, but because every album by 21 Pilots kind of has its own unique sound, it's hard to do an objective ranking of all the albums. I will say though, in terms of personal preference, Blurryface or Trench would be at the top of the list. And this new album, Clancy, is definitely up there with them. It gives us a fresh new sound while simultaneously fitting in very nicely with the rest of their catalog, which is arguably not something that's very easy to do. The songs also fit together nicely without all sounding the same. In fact, I think this is one of their strongest albums, in that there are only one or two songs which I find to be much weaker than the others. So out of 13 songs, that's 11 very strong ones. There were two main points about this album that I found to be a bit of a drawback. Firstly, a lot of these songs had a very similar structure. They started with an intro, went into the main song, and had an outro. And that was almost a template that they reused over and over again. Obviously, there are some exceptions to this, but by and large, that structure remained. Each song sounded different enough that this wasn't really an issue, but at the same time, this isn't really something they've struggled with in the past, so it stood out on this album. However, I will say that is something of a minor point for me and doesn't really take away that much from the overall quality of the album. The other issue I had with the album was also a minor one, and it was regarding the amount of lore that it contained. Some people are saying that they're very disappointed that there wasn't as much lore on this album as they expected, and other people are saying that they shouldn't complain about this, and that every album by 21 Pilots doesn't have to be completely lore heavy. I think both of these perspectives are true and valid to a point, but I will say my main issue was not that I was disappointed in the amount of lore, I was just confused. It was very much presented that Clancy was going to be an album that was almost as lore heavy as Trench. One thing I've wondered about this though is maybe not many songs are explicitly lore related as they were in Trench, but maybe they're implicitly related to the lore. Over the past few months, I myself have been considering different albums, such as Self-Titled, Regional Best, or Vessel, that aren't explicitly heavy in lore, but could clearly relate to the DEMA narrative. And I'm not alone in doing that. So I'm wondering if Clancy's another example of that. There are some parts of this album that are very clearly related to the lore in an explicit sense, talking about Banditos, or Trench, or Nico. But then there's others that relate to the general storyline in a broader sense, but are still related. Also, it's kind of similar to Blurryface in terms of lore. That album had several references, but not every song was explicitly DEMA related. And I think the same is true for Clancy. Which makes me wonder, maybe Clancy isn't the sequel to Trench, it's actually the sequel to Blurryface. Or maybe the prequel. Who knows? Anyway, with that being said, let's actually get into a review of the album itself, starting with Overcompensate. Sonically speaking, Overcompensate seems to pick up where Trench left off. We start with a slow melodic piano melody reminiscent of the final track on Trench, Leave the City, before moving into a somewhat heavier beat with a sampling of one of my favorite songs by 21 Pilots, Bandito. Then there's an incredibly smooth transition from that into a heavier, perhaps grungier rap-style song. Besides Paladin Strait, this is probably the most lore-heavy song on the entire album, and it is also one of my favorites. The Dangerous Ben symbol referenced in the song refers to one of many mathematical symbols which was used by the Bourbaki group. While it is not entirely clear what the purpose of the symbol is in the DEMA storyline, it is interesting to note that it introduces the theme of driving on roads in cars, which is fairly prevalent throughout the rest of the album, but if you look back through 21 Pilots' entire discography, the symbol or image of a car has been present the entire time. And while it's something that people have noticed repeating from one album to the next, it's often something that people haven't put much thought into. Obviously, throughout Clancy, we get many more images of cars and headlights, and what that specifically means to Tyler on a personal level. But perhaps there's another meaning as it relates to the DEMA narrative that we haven't quite understood or grasped fully. And perhaps that's something that needs to be explored further. For instance, in The Outside, there's a line in which he says, "I've got a long drive, so I'll tape my eyes so I don't fall asleep again." But what exactly is the long drive to which he's referring? I will confess, when I first heard Next Semester, it was one of my least favorite songs by 21 Pilots, but I'm grateful that they released it as a single, because that kind of forced me to re-listen to the song over and over again, and it really grew on me. It's definitely something of a new sound for 21 Pilots to lean this heavily into the kind of punk rock style of music. But one thing that it does really well is bring back the raw energy that they had in their earlier albums, and which sort of faded away over the years. The music video is really well done, with several references to Heavy Dirty Soul, both in the sparks that are in the background of the stage, and also the way that they drive by Josh when he's playing the drums. Like many songs on Clancy, Next Semester is talking about repeating cycles and trying to break free from that pattern. But it is also a song which delves into a very personal and meaningful moment in Tyler's own life. Backslide is an example of a song which, while not explicitly name-dropping any lore elements, clearly does relate to the DEMA storyline. It references having one last shot to break free of the vicious cycle, as well as this interesting line: "I used to be the champion of a world you can't see." One possible theory is that Clancy, Blurryface, and Tyler are all one and the same, or that Tyler used to enjoy being Blurryface, being the champion of the DEMA world, and then realized that he actually needs to break free and escape, at which point his alter ego, Clancy, emerged. Certainly, if you look at their albums, Blurryface is a prime example of Tyler identifying with that character of Blurryface, and taking on that persona. Whereas Clancy is very much him identifying with this new character and trying to break free. But this line also reminds me of that line from Self-Titled. He used to see dreams at night, and now he's just watching the backs of his eyes. The idea of dreaming specifically implies a certain sense of hope and looking forward to the future, whereas just watching the backs of your eyes implies a certain sense of resignation and boredom, being fine with where you are and not trying to change or improve on it at all. Midwest Indigo is one of the tracks which I found to be somewhat weaker on this album, but it's also a prime example of how good this album is, because the song is not bad at all. It's just not quite as good as the rest of the album. But what I did like about the song is not only does it have a great energy, it also is very reminiscent of a song like Slowtown, bringing one back to the nostalgia of childhood, and providing a lighthearted break from the first three songs, which are definitely much heavier. And while the lyricism of this song is not particularly deep, there is some clever wordplay. For instance, I requested counsel with a counselor, but he canceled twice. So while I may rank this song as one of my two least favorites, I certainly don't think that it should have been excluded from the album. Next up is a song which was almost excluded from the album, but luckily Josh convinced Tyler to keep it on the final track list, and it is one of the best songs on here. It is also interesting that for a song which was almost cut from the album, it is very lore-heavy, and it also provides a good amount of evidence for some of the theories which I and others have been proposing, about the fact that Self-Titled is pretty relevant to the DEMA storyline. Officially, Tyler said there are only 3 videos on this album which relate to the lore, a sort of trilogy of Overcompensate, Navigating, and Paladin Strait, the final of which has not been released. But while it doesn't necessarily fit into that trilogy, the video for Routines in the Night is very lore-heavy. It is very reminiscent to the song and first single off of Blurryface, Fairly Local. Tyler's once again wearing a white coat and walking through a hallway, off of which various different rooms open. The main room, in which the video starts and ends, shows Tyler sleeping in bed, and at several points throughout the video he turns and he lies on his back, staring up at the ceiling with his arms outstretched on either side. I feel like we've seen something very similar to that before, but I can't quite remember where. The video and the song present this as a tour of the layout of his head, with the different rooms branching off of it. Interestingly, I was able to count 7 distinct rooms, which could be said to relate to the 7 albums which they have released. For instance, the red wood-paneled room could represent Clancy, the gray basement-looking room with the brick walls could represent Vessel, the plain red room with the door slightly ajar, and which switches between red and white throughout the video, could represent Blurryface. The blue and white room with the yellow bandito flowers in it could represent Trench. The room with the green walls and the bishop standing in the corner while Josh is drumming could be Scaled and Icy. The room with Clancy sitting on the floor with the coat rack of Bishop's cloaks behind him could be Regional at best. And the corner in which Josh is drumming while cramped under the sloped ceiling could be Self-Titled. It is also interesting to note that this video seems to be taking place in a cabin in the middle of a forest, as you can see by looking out the windows of the wood-paneled room. That room itself seems like it could be a treehouse, although a very fancy one. But perhaps they're supposed to be in the middle of the forest, which is shown at the beginning of Overcompensate, and in which they're playing during the song Ride. It definitely seems to be the case that there are many more lore-related clues to be found throughout this video. These are just a few things which stood out to me after only watching it 2 or 3 times. Vignette is definitely one of my favorite tracks on Clancy. And while the video may not be lore heavy, the song is in several ways. It references a tribute to zombies, which is very similar to lyricisms found in Heavy Dirty Soul, but it also has a return to this kind of third-person narrative, which we see a lot in the self-titled album. But it isn't exclusively told in the third person, it blurs the lines between third and first. And what's interesting about that is towards the end of the song, he repeats over and over again, "No, no, not me, it's for a friend." Which makes you wonder if maybe all those songs in which he was discussing something in the third person, for instance, Trap Door, are actually about him, and he was just projecting something onto an imaginary figure. And obviously the entire DEMA narrative and all the lore that comes with that is a way of him projecting everything onto third-person characters. In Trench, Clancy very much seemed to be a third-person figure again, someone external to Tyler. But then in this album, he's finally acknowledging that he is, in fact, Clancy. And I think this is part of what Tyler meant by being more upfront about the narrative and everything becoming more clear. Sure, we don't have a lot of explicit name-dropping lore references in this album, but the album is named after someone we know to be a figure in the DEMA narrative. And if that is the case, then you can also argue that the vast majority of the songs in the album are related to that narrative. And perhaps the fact that these things are not shrouded behind the Bishops and Nico and Clancy is, in a sense, providing that clarity. Moving away from saying, no, it's not me, this is about a friend, or some other third person, he's acknowledging that no, actually, that's a denial. This is actually about me and who I am and what I'm struggling with. In a somewhat similar fashion to Next Semester, the first time I heard Jenna's version of the Craving, I wasn't a fan. I very much liked the single version which they released, but this one felt a little out of place on the album. It was too stripped back. It was almost like the acoustic version which they could have released later after the album came out, but shouldn't have been the actual studio version of the song. But also, like with Next Semester, as time went on, I actually became more and more fond of this track. It works well as the midpoint of the album, by kind of slowing down the pace and taking a bit of a breather, before launching back into the heaviness that the second half brings. One thing that's interesting to note about the single version of the song is in the music video, it starts by looking at the floor of the room in which Tyler is playing. And over that floor, certain shadows are flowing. Shadows which are similar to those which play over the letter in I Am Clancy, and which sort of look like the spinning blades of a ceiling fan. Lavish is definitely my least favorite song on this album. But like I said with Midwest Indigo, that doesn't mean that it is itself a bad song, I just think it's the worst on this album. The music video for it is a lot of fun, and the song itself is quite fun, but it's just not my favorite. And I don't think I have that much more to say about it other than that. Next up is Navigating. And this is the other song for which there was a lore-related video. While in some ways it's similar in sound to Next Semester, it isn't identical, and I am glad that it was kept on the album, even though Tyler was considering cutting it. This is another song that kind of had to grow on me over time, but the chorus in particular was something that I was a fan of from the beginning. The idea of navigating is one which we've seen repeated in both Blurryface and Trench. The idea of not being good with directions that we saw come up in The Judge, and the idea of east is up and their compass lying, which we've seen throughout Trench and the different ladders that we've gotten since then. I also wonder if there's a connection to be made between this song and Chlorine. At the beginning of Chlorine, we hear a voice say, "Where are you? It's been a little while." And in this song he says, "Pardon my delay, I'm navigating." He also talks about the idea of disassociating, which could relate to what I was talking about earlier, with presenting certain songs in third person, or this whole world of DEMA, as a disassociation between himself and these other characters. Lyrically, in many ways, Snapback is very similar to Backslide, and it makes you wonder if both these songs are actually necessary to have on the album. But I'm glad they're both there, because they're both very good songs, and they also sound very different. It also brings back the idea of driving once again, commandeered a hot ride and drove it until the engine died, and also something which he kicked back in 17, which was the year before Trench came out, and if I'm not mistaken was the year that the band went on their hiatus, which is rather interesting. I wouldn't be surprised if this is one of those songs which, as time goes on, becomes more and more analyzed, and more about it becomes clear. But right now, it seems like it's full of a lot of meaning that isn't quite apparent yet. It is also a very good song on the album. Oldies Station is definitely one of the most uplifting and hopeful songs by 21 Pilots, and it is surprising to me that a lot of people don't seem to like this song. Although I do understand that a lot of people like Lavish, and I don't, so. It's true that it is a bit slower than the rest of the songs, but it also works very well placed where it is towards the end of the album as things are beginning to wrap up. It also discusses embracing the fact that things always change, which could be a negative thing as the things you once liked or loved disappear and you change to something new which is not quite as nice. But it could also be a positive, hopeful thing, that instead of being forever stuck in the cycle trapped in DEMA, you can eventually escape, and that will change. Their second to last track, At the Risk of Feeling Dumb, is one which I had very low expectations for, but it ended up being one of my favorite tracks on the album. It's a brilliant return to the reggae sound, which has often characterized many of their songs, without it just sounding exactly the same as what they've done before. It is also reminiscent in both lyricism and sound to something which you might have heard on Regional at Best, which is fun to hear. And then at last we get to Paladin Strait, which is arguably the most beautiful song which they've ever created, topping even Bandito. This past Saturday, I released a video discussing how this song could be related to the final song on self-titled Isle of Flightless Birds, and I spent a considerable amount of time then discussing the song and the lore behind it, so I don't need to get too in-depth at this moment, but I had two possible theories about how the music video might end, neither of which I'm terribly convinced will happen, but it's interesting to consider that they might. The first is that when Clancy reaches the tower and finally confronts Nico, that figure will say those final lines, and then he'll turn to come face to face with Clancy, and it will be revealed that he's Josh. But his eyes are glowing because he's been seized by Blurryface after giving his life for Clancy. I don't think that's very likely, but it could be quite powerful. The second, and I think other people have proposed this as well, is that Nico will turn, say hello Clancy, and then Overcompensate will start playing. Overall, Clancy is an incredible body of work with very few flaws, and succeeds in being one of the best albums which 21 Pilots have ever released. If you haven't heard the entire thing yet, I don't know what you're doing, but you should go listen to it. And I am very excited to see where the story will end, because I certainly don't think what we have right now is the ending. As always, thank you so much for watching. I know this was a bit of a longer video, so I appreciate you sticking with me to the end. Be sure to include your own thoughts about this album and any of the theories which I proposed in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more movie reviews and commentary.